Balake. Where is Balake at?
My name's Blake.
Do you want to go to war, Balake? I'm for real. Aaron.
Aaron's here. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a fantastic Tuesday. Had to check the calendar just to make sure. Welcome back to SPTV, where every day is a great day not to be in a cult. Well, I'll tell you what. Someone's going to war. And I guess for this video, we're talking about Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh is a pretty, I don't know, is it fair to call him a soldier for the right in the culture war? Now, on this channel, we have a very strict no politics policy. And luckily, the Matt Walsh video we're going to look at today isn't about anything political. It's about Danny Masterson. Now, one could argue that the reason Matt Walsh is talking about Danny Masterson and then Russell Brand is because he's using them as examples for whatever battle, you know, he's considers he's fighting in the culture war. I don't know, what is it? The war against men? I don't know what Matt Walsh would describe it as. But I promise you, we're not dealing with anything political. And I did go on Chris Cuomo last week. So, you know, that was a lefty thing, pissed some people off. Now we'll do a righty thing, piss some more people off. But seriously, guys, this has nothing to do with politics. But when someone as who has a platform as big as Matt Walsh casually gets things very, very wrong regarding the Danny Masterson prosecution and the testimony and the Jane Does, I think it's worth addressing, because people with giant platforms casually getting things very, very wrong is how misinformation spreads so quickly in our society, in my opinion. So, you know, why not address? It's only a few minutes that he talks about the Masterson thing. He manages to get an incredible number of things wrong in only 3 minutes. And let's break it down and let's talk about what the truth is. So here we go.
Danny Masterson is an actor who most people haven't thought about for a long time, if at all. By all accounts, his career peaked all the way back in 2006 with the conclusion of the sitcom That 70s Show. But a few years ago, all of a sudden, Masterson's name was everywhere. That's because in March of 2017, the year that the hashtag Me Too movement began in earnest, Masterson was accused of sexual assault by 3 women.
False. Danny Masterson's victims came forward many years before 2017. First of all, we have to look at when they came forward to the Scientology authorities, and then we have to look at when they came forward to the legal authorities. Jane Doe 1 came forward to the Scientology authorities, had come forward to both the Scientology authorities and the legal authorities, the police, by 2004. That was over a decade before Me Too started. Jane Doe 2, for her own personal reasons, having already had a lot of failure reporting sexual assault to the Scientology authorities previously, didn't even bother reporting to the Scientology authorities because she knew that doesn't get you anywhere. So when she finally came forward to the legal authorities, that still was before 2017, was before Me Too. I have noticed a lot of press casually lumps in the charges against Danny Masterson with the Me Too movement. Usually they're lumping it in as some sort of way to be dismissive about it, when in fact, it all occurred well before the Me Too movement. So that's just one thing.
In response, without waiting for a trial, Netflix summarily fired Masterson from his role as a series regular on one of their shows. And 3 years later, in the summer of 2020, Masterson was formally charged with 3 rapes in Los Angeles, a jurisdiction that, of course, believes all women.
By the way, I want to say that one of the reasons it took so long to bring bring charges against Danny Masterson was because Jackie Lacey, the Los Angeles district attorney, had sat on the file for years, reportedly because she intended to use it as a political football to bring those charges right before she was set to run for re-election. And that is what caused the Jane Does and the attorneys to sit around for 2 years being like, is anything going to happen? Is anything going to happen? Is anything going to happen? And so, again, this is a case of Matt's almost using the fact that politicians playing politics. He's using some of the shenanigans that the responsibility for which lie at the feet of these politicians, of which an elected DA I consider to be a politician, and somehow using it against the Jane Does themselves. Totally unfair.
Prosecutor said that one rape occurred in 2001, another in early 2003, and a third in late 2003. Now, right off the bat, the timeline raises some obvious questions. For one thing, how is it possible to prove a rape beyond a reasonable doubt 20 years after the fact, in the absence of any physical evidence of violence or drugging?
Okay, let's take a look at that. Okay, now obviously he's referring to only the 3 Jane Does for which charges were brought against Danny. There's another 3 Jane Does who have come forward publicly and said they were also drugged and assaulted by Danny. 2 of those Jane Does testified as witnesses in the trial. Many more of those Jane Does have come forward and were not witnesses and did not testify. So, by the way, Jane Doe 1, 2, and 3 are the ones who Danny was charged with. You then had Trish Vesey, Kathleen Jenkins, who have come forward and testified as witnesses. And then you had Bobette. Bobette, I apologize. I always say your last name wrong. Is it Rials or Rialis? Rials? Bobette appeared on an episode of Leah Remini Scientology in the Aftermath and publicly told her story of being drugged and attacked by Danny. There are somewhere between 8 and 10 women who have come forward, all with stories of being drugged and assaulted by Danny Masterson. But Matt minimizes it by just talking about the 3, and that's fine. He faced charges for 3, but it's still a minimization of the reality. And also, how do you prove something that happened 20 years ago? No physical evidence. Guys, the number of cases of sexual assault that actually have physical evidence, or what they call a rape kit, you go to the hospital, they take DNA and all that stuff, is so small. Now, evidence, first of all, we should say testimony is evidence. Corroborating testimony is evidence. Written reports are evidence. Police reports are evidence. Matt and some other people out there who tend to be just apologists for horrible people, people like House and Habit, people like Colonel Kurtz? Horrible people. Horrible people. They keep repeating this line: no evidence, no evidence, no physical evidence. It is such a lie. It's so disingenuous, and it's so dishonest. There was a ton of evidence, corroborating evidence, reports, some of which I'm going to bring up after some of his next comments here.
Now, you might think that the accusers must have had airtight stories, but that's not true in this case. In fact, one of the accusers previously told authorities that Masterson had not raped her. She says that she only realized years later that she was raped. She originally thought it was consensual, and then years after the fact, changed her mind.
That is so completely inaccurate and dishonest, and a misrepresentation of the facts and a misrepresentation of the testimony. I am only going to assume right now that he's talking about Jane Doe 3. One thing that many of the jurors may have found confusing, and I was there in the courtroom every day, and I say they may have found it confusing because I myself found it confusing between the line of questioning from the deputy district attorney and the line of questioning from the defense attorney, and sometimes they go back and forth as far as the time period they're questioning about, and sometimes the facts, even when questions are asked correctly and answers are given correctly or accurately, sometimes the facts can get jumbled, and it's hard to keep track of what happened, when, who, where, and all that kind of stuff. One thing that's very important to know about Jane Doe 3, that this is Chrissy Carnell Bixler, the testimony that she gave, and the charges Danny was facing, is that Jane Doe 3 testified to 2 separate and distinct incidents. One of those incidents involved being drugged and assaulted by Danny. The second incident did not involve being drugged. The incident that involved being drugged was the one Jane Doe 3 first went to report to the police. That is the incident that to her was rape. That's what she went to report. Now, in the state of California, it's worth understanding that drugging someone and then assaulting them is not legally considered use of force. That's important to understand when we talk about the charges Danny was facing. Danny was not charged for the incident that involved drugging his girlfriend, Jane Doe 3. He was not facing any charges for that incident because it didn't involve the use of force. In order for the incidents that Danny was facing to not be subject to the statute of limitations, it had to be an incident that involved the use of force. And the drugging incident did not meet that criteria. So even though Jane Doe 3 was allowed to testify on the witness stand as to what happened in that incident, when the jury goes back to deliberate on whether Danny's guilty or not guilty of the charges he was facing, that's not the incident they were deliberating about. They were deliberating about an incident that actually happened much earlier, where Jane Doe 3 woke up to Danny having intercourse with her. And she basically, which she said was a common occurrence. And she said that, but this was the first time that she said no and fought back. And she's like, no, stop. No. He wouldn't stop. She grabbed his hair, yanked him off of her, and then he hit her and then dragged her across the floor by her hair. At the time that Jane Doe 3 went to the police to report the drugging incident, she did not consider that other incident that happened many years earlier or a year or two earlier. She didn't consider that to be rape. Because when she had come forward to Scientology authorities previously to report that incident of, the physical violence, they told her, you can't rape a girlfriend. It's not rape. Stop using the word rape. You can't rape a girlfriend. You're in a relationship. So there was a particular police interview that Jane Doe 3 was giving where she said she didn't consider that incident to have been rape. She considered it to have been domestic violence, but she didn't consider it to have been rape. She later on came to understand why, legally speaking, that was rape. And because that incident involved the use of force, in fact, it's the only, like, physical violence. In fact, and I apologize, Chris, if I get this wrong, my recollection is that Chrissy said that was the only incident she could particularly recall that involved physical violence. And because that incident included physical violence, that is the incident he was charged with. Okay. So for him to say the story changed over time, the stories have never changed over time. They have been entirely consistent. Okay, let's get back to it.
All this explains why late last year, the jury deadlocked. There was a mistrial. According to the foreman on that jury, they were leaning towards acquittal on every count. And he said that the reason for that is that they found the stories from the accusers to be inconsistent, contradictory, and implausible.
Wow. What Matt Walsh doesn't say there is that jury foreman was later exposed for having lied on his jury questionnaire about having himself personally or any of the family members been convicted of felonies or personally having had any involvement with the police. That jury foreman's own son was prosecuted and convicted of a crime very similar to the crime Danny Masterson was on trial for. And his own son had been convicted and sent to prison for that crime by the exact same DA's office that was prosecuting Danny Masterson. You want to talk about a conflict of interest? That jury foreman was later found to be working with Danny Masterson's defense team to try to get the charges against Danny thrown out completely instead of simply having Danny retried. That jury foreman submitted an affidavit to the defense, that no other reasonable jury could ever, under any circumstances, find Danny Masterson unanimously guilty of these crimes because the Jane Does were simply completely Unbelievable. Now, we know all this because Tony Ortega and Chris Shelton gave that jury foreman a platform and published an interview with that jury foreman, even though the Jane Does asked them, do you think you could hold off on publishing that interview until after the DA's office has announced whether they're going to retry Danny Masterson or not? Well, Tony and Chris thought they had a scoop and they weren't going to sit on this scoop. So they published the interview anyway. And that's the only reason anyone even knows all of the jury foreman's horrible ideas about the Jane Does and how they're all just a bunch of lying, gold-digging, dishonest women. Why in the hell do we care what that jury foreman thinks? But Matt Walsh doesn't have all that background info or chose not to share that background info. I would say that that jury foreman has a lot of egg on his face. Now that the guy he was trying to let walk free, he was working with the defense to let Danny walk free. Now Danny's in prison for the rest of his life. All right, let's keep going.
But then just a couple of weeks later, a couple of weeks ago, I should say, as you might have heard, Masterson was put on trial again. And this time around, the judge changed the rules. The judge allowed testimony that Masterson had drugged his victims, even though there was no physical evidence of that. In the first trial, the prosecution was only allowed to describe the condition of the accusers after they consumed alcoholic beverages that Masterson gave them, describing them as woozy and disoriented. They were not allowed to directly claim that the women were drugged because there was no evidence of that. There was no evidence that their wooziness was the result of anything more than the alcohol they were drinking.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. It is true that in the first trial, they were not allowed to directly say that they had been drugged. They were allowed in the first trial to testify. They were allowed to say everything except that phrase. They weren't allowed to say, I think I was drugged or I was drugged. They were allowed to say, I had half of a drink and I felt incapacitated. And then the deputy DA would continue with a line of questioning like, had you basically throughout, I'm totally paraphrasing. I'm not trying to be accurate, very accurate about any of this, but the line of questioning, like, did you have experience drinking? Had you drank that much before? How often? Do you generally, would you say that after that drink, that feeling was way, way out of proportion to anything you'd ever felt before? Like they were allowed to create the impression in the jury. A reasonable person would infer, oh, they were drugged, but they were never allowed to say I was drugged. Now, what happened is that in the second trial, what was permitted was an expert witness, an expert toxicologist with the LAPD was allowed to testify when he says, oh, there's no physical evidence. What physical evidence? How are you ever going to have physical evidence that you were drugged? And by the way, one of the things the toxicologist testified to was that the particular drug in question, which is suspected to have been GHB, if I recall correctly, sometimes I get the acronym wrong, is that it leaves your system almost immediately. So even if you were to have gone to the hospital an hour or two later and taken a test, there'd be nothing. There'd be nothing anyway. And so a toxicologist was brought on the stand and was allowed to give her expert testimony, which is really her expert opinion, as to whether the symptoms, all of the charged Jane Does and the testifying Jane Doe witnesses were consistent with having been drugged with GHB. And the other thing is that he's it's what Matt Walsh doesn't say. That's the inaccuracy here. He makes it seem like, oh, the big difference was to testify that they were drugged. That had, in my opinion, no effect whatsoever on the difference between the outcome of the first trial and the outcome of the second trial. One of the main differences was the expert testimony that was permitted on the subject of Scientology policies and procedures. As a juror, it's very understandable to struggle with the fact that two of the women didn't come forward to the police for north of 15 years. It's easy to struggle with that. It's perfectly understandable to struggle with that. Now, never mind the fact Jane Doe 1 went to the police right away, even though it was against the Scientology rules, and she suffered the consequences for having done so. But what, and Claire Headley of SPTV fame, Claire Headley was the expert witness on the Scientology policies and procedures that prohibit Scientologists from coming forward to the police. I believe it is the expert testimony on Scientology that was one of the linchpins on the jurors going, oh, I get it. So not only are there rules that prevent you from going to the police, but Scientology has its own internal policies and procedures to deal with this kind of stuff. Oh, and you're saying those procedures were undertaken. Oh, you're saying those reports were written. Oh, you're saying the internal Scientology investigations did occur. Oh, you're saying Danny did actually admit to this, but he admitted to it in the world of Scientology. He didn't admit to it to the police. Oh, we get it. I honestly don't think the expert testimony from the toxicologist was, I mean, it was interesting, but I don't think any of the jurors were really wondering, like, you know, the testimony from the Jane Does pretty much stood on its own when it came to how they felt. How they felt after, you know, having consumed a very minor amount of alcohol. Okay, let's see what else Matt has to say here.
But in the second trial, that kind of caution was thrown to the wind. And again, without any actual evidence, Masterson was accused of drugging his alleged victims. And that,
I'm sorry, when he says no actual evidence, I just have to reiterate, testimony is evidence. I think people misunderstand the difference between testimony and hearsay. Hearsay is testifying to what you heard someone else say. It's testifying to something you weren't present for. Testimony is evidence. Okay.
apparently,
And by the way, he wasn't found guilty of drugging the Jane Does. That's not what he was charged with. He was charged with violent rape. The drugging, he wasn't found guilty of drugging. That's not something the jurors were asked to come to a decision on. So even then, Matt has his information wrong.
did the trick. Masterson was convicted after the retrial, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now, you don't have to like Danny Masterson or know who he is or believe he's innocent to understand the implications of what happened to him. Danny Masterson's case is proof that even in 2023, years after the hashtag #MeToo hysteria has faded, physical evidence of wrongdoing is not required to convict someone of rape and destroy their life. Neither is timely reporting or even a consistent story from the alleged victims.
So there you go. I mean, that's where he really just gets it as wrong as possible. There was plenty of physical evidence in this case. Internal reports written by multiple people at the time of the attacks in 2001 and 2003 is physical evidence. It's not DNA evidence, but it's physical evidence. A physical report that was made at the time, not 20 years later, not 5 years later, not 3 years later, at the time is evidence. It's corroborating evidence. You also had a lot of witnesses who testified, and I don't remember the legal term. I guess it's just corroborating witnesses. Even witnesses who are no longer friends with the Jane Does, who don't even like the Jane Does. And I'm speaking in generalities. Like there's one in particular, one person was called to testify who is not on good terms anymore with the Jane Doe whom she was providing corroborating testimony for. And yet she still showed up and said, yes, we were at this dinner. Yes, this was, many, many, many years ago. And Danny Masterson's name came up and the Jane Doe got very, upset, and she stood up and she screamed, Danny Masterson, assaulted me. And again, that's an example of it's just corroborating testimony. She's like, yes, and other people were there. And, you see how Matt's mischaracterizing it. Oh, you can come forward 20 years ago and just say that something happened to you. If that's all there was, Danny wouldn't have been convicted, especially not after a first trial, where it was a hung jury. And I should say that even in, you know, if you've been following this closely, you know that Danny was convicted of the charges against Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2, and it was once again another hung jury and a mistrial on the charge of Jane Doe 3. I sincerely believe the reason that the jury continues to be hung regarding the charge on Jane Doe 3 is because the charge is related to the incident that wasn't the incident Jane Doe 3 first went to the police to report. There's two reasons I think that the jury has struggled with the charges against Jane Doe 3. One reason is what I just said, that's not the incident she first went to report. And the defense team did a reasonable job, or at least a good enough job, of putting doubt into the jury's mind about, even, you know, because this is how the defense team would articulate it, is even Jane Doe 3 didn't think this was rape when she first went to the authorities. And you go, well, yeah, I mean, that's true. She said that. She said that she didn't think that was, because she had already been told you can't rape a girlfriend. And the incident that involved the physical violence had occurred a year or 2 or 3 earlier. And so she had this in her mind. You can't rape a girlfriend. You can't rape a girlfriend. And then this incident happened where Danny actually drugged her at a restaurant and then took her home and assaulted her in a way that even in Jane Doe 3's mind, where she thought you couldn't rape a girlfriend, even with that in her mind, she woke up the next morning, and when she found out what happened, she goes, oh no, Danny raped me. Right. So anyway, that's the one reason I think the jury struggles with that charge. And also the fact that the incident in question that involved the physical violence is, as a part of Jane Doe 3's testimony, she said her waking up to Danny having intercourse with her was common, a common thing throughout their 6-year relationship. And it's understandable if a juror would go, well, if you're saying it was common, then we're going to call it consensual. If you're saying that was common, we're going to call that consensual. And I think the defense team did a good enough job of putting doubt into the jury's mind whether there was, the word makes me uncomfortable, but I'll just say it, whether there was penetration after Jane Doe 1 said no and pulled him off of her or not. I'm just saying, and I'm not saying there wasn't. I'm saying I think the defense team probably did a good enough job of making the jurors think there was at least reasonable doubt. And but anyway, do you see how this is different than what Matt Walsh is representing? Now, what's interesting is that Matt Walsh only mentioned this Danny Masterson thing as an intro to talk about the Russell Brand scandal that's currently unfolding in the media. And, you know, it's always dangerous to try to put two things into the same category without truly understanding the differences between these things. And I don't know anything about the Russell Brand situation. But do you see how Matt Walsh probably thinks it's just safe to put these two things? They seem similar enough alike to put them into the same conversation. But the truth is, there was tons of evidence in the Danny Masterson case. And I'm just glad that the DAs chose to persist in trying to get that conviction. And I truly believe that as more victims come forward, I believe Masterson will probably be tried in the future for additional victims. And I truly believe that if the DA's office chooses to try Danny for the charges against Jane Doe 3 for a third time, that they will be successful. Because I think it's pretty obvious. I think it's pretty obvious what techniques the defense attorneys used that were likely effective. And I think that could be overcome in a new trial. That's my personal opinion. So there are some other people who have done videos complaining, is the word that I'll use, complaining that Danny could be convicted for such a thing after so many years. And there's one other video in particular I'm probably going to address just because she has a pretty large audience and so many people have sent me the video that it's probably worth addressing. Not as an attack on the creator, but as an example of how misinformation can be spread by people carelessly summarizing this trial as someone convicted with no evidence and nothing but hearsay 20 years after the fact. It's just not true. It's just not a good description of what happened here. It's completely inaccurate. All right, let me jump on some of these super chats, and then so much more to come this afternoon, guys. So much more. If you're one of the 3,700 people watching live, do me a favor real quick. Hit that like button, please, por favor. It's fast, it's free, it's easy, and it actually does help. Okay, Jamie Dodger says, maximum respect to the Jane Does for all their bravery. Absolutely. ML, haters gonna hate. Keep it up, Aaron. Thank you very much. Elizabeth Marino, he probably doesn't want to hear the truth, but is there any way you could offer to have a diplomatic talk with him on his show? Ooh. Oh boy, you guys know how scared I get getting anywhere near any political footballs on this channel. I mean, I took hate for going on Chris Cuomo. I don't know, maybe because I went on Chris Cuomo, I could probably go on Matt Walsh and everybody would forgive me for it. It's not that I don't like talking about politics. I love talking about politics, but not on this channel. I know that's not why you guys ever subscribe to me. It's not what you come to me for. In this climate, you can't say anything political, even while trying to be neutral without pissing off half of any group. So you guys know how much I stay away from it. But I got to tell you, if Matt actually wanted to talk about this on his show, I'd probably say yes. I'd be terrified, but I'd probably say yes. Okay, Jamie Dodger. Matt Walsh is what we call here in England a bell end. Look this slang up, my overseas friends. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you for the chat. Russ Hampton, how many abusers are in Scientology? Can you say a definite number who you know are doing this? And can we put them in the spotlight somehow? Keep up the awesome work, big guy. Russ, it's hard for me to put a number on that. Just even offhand, it'd be very, very difficult. And I have on this channel many, many times taken the opportunity to openly, publicly expose and shame such abusers, particularly such abusers of children on this channel. And I will be doing it a lot more in the future. I mean, I've already got a lot of info that I could do videos about right now. It's just as time goes by, I have to refamiliarize myself with all the info before I can responsibly do a video about it. And I've had so much to talk about lately. Those videos just gradually slip lower and lower on my list of things to discuss on any given day. But you better believe I'll be getting back to it eventually. No question about it. Telperion, do you know why it is not possible to bring forth both incidences for Jane Doe 3? Is there a limit per victim? It's just because the state does not consider drugging and assaulting a woman to be use of force. And just the statute of the rules about the statute of limitations were such that in order for Danny to be tried, like individually, each one of the charges he was facing would have been past the statute of limitations. But because there were multiple charges being tried at the same time, and as long as the charges involved use of force, then the statute of limitations did not apply collectively to the charges. And it's pretty shocking to me that drugging someone and assaulting them is not use of force, but that's what the law says in the state of California specifically. And that was the problem. Thank you very much. Ken's channel, saying there is no evidence is a product of CSI TV shows. Everyone thinks the only evidence is a single hair, lipstick on a cup, etc. That's a really good point, Ken. That's a really good point. Okay, Telperion, how is the behavior of that foreman legal? Can charges be pressed? I just don't know. Meaning, I do know they're not going to be pressing charges against him. I just can't give the exact explanation for why. Thank you very much. Caro Abibi? Caro Abib? AB? I like Abibi. Statements like the ones made by Matt Walsh make me wonder, do some of these men have a very good reason to wish no one believes any women coming forward? Yeah, I know. That's a good question. Jacqueline Leach, keep up the nuances, slugger. Thank you, Jacqueline. Oh boy. Chloe Bannon. No surprise. Walsh is known as a PDF file defender. I like that little way of getting around the censors. Thank you, Chloe. Okay, Telperion, how does the appeal work? Do the Jane Does need to go through the whole song and dance again? When you say appeal, I think, are you just referring to the fact that Danny Masterson has a certain amount of time in which he can appeal? he can. Okay, so if he appeals, and it depends on what the basis of the appeal is. Like the appeal is going to be to have the jury's decision thrown out, or the trial never should have occurred in the first place. Do you like it depends. So I guess what you're saying, is it possible that Danny could have filed an appeal and his request could be granted? And I guess the next step is, does that mean the ruling is he never should have been tried in the first place, or the trial needs to be redone? So the answer to your question depends on the exact details of the appeal and what gets approved. I don't believe any such appeal will be approved, but what do I know, guys? I grew up in a cult after all. Thank you very much for the super sticker. And Quincy Wheeler, everyone send Goldie some love. She has her hands full with this chat. For those of you who watch my replays all the time but never join a live stream, Goldie is the moderator in the live chat, and she is the world's best moderator. And I imagine on anything that's potentially politically divisive, as Matt Walsh, I imagine the live stream is ablaze. Yeah, guys, no politics usually even applies to the live chat. depending. All right, everyone, that is all I have on this for now. Again, so much more to come later this afternoon. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. Hit that like button, please. Thank you as always to everyone who watches until the very end, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe